the winding stop by the time they got here, but there's something in the pipes up there that occasionally does this, and I hope it will stop. But
Okay. It's not terribly noticeable.
Okay, I was going to say it drove me nuts for a while, but I've kind of gotten used to it, sadly.
Well, again, we're glad to have you here. As I said in our setup for this, that we keep it to an hour. The class is the business of communications for Washington University.
Mm-hmm.
We have 9 students in our class, and I've been trying to bring in guest speakers like you to talk about various aspects of the business, particularly aspects that align with the units that we're covering at the time. And right now, what we're covering is a little bit about sort of alternative, outside the mainstream news organizations and communications entities. A couple of quick housekeeping notes. I'm not going to introduce you, Steve, because they all had sufficient background posted about you with links to some of your work.
Sure.
In the classroom. Another little housekeeping note is if you find it disquieting to see Google bounce back and forth between the speakers, you can click on the person's face and they will be the primary speaker on the screen. I also have questions from the students who couldn't be here, so we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. But I thought I'd just start with one here for you. And I'm asking you this because you are somebody who has really tried to be innovative in journalism and particularly in newspapering. And I thought I'd say it's the year 1984. It's 30 years ago.
Okay.
And
I worked at the Des Moines Register then.
And you're in charge of the entire newspaper industry. What do you do differently?
Well, certainly would embrace and explore the opportunities of the digital marketplace earlier and better, and with the benefit of hindsight. But I actually was on the periphery. I don't want to say part, like I was a key contributor or anything, but in an early, but it was a very telltale to me in retrospect. But I think at the time I saw it as a key mistake. I was involved with a project called Star Text that you may remember having read about. The Fort Worth Star Telegram was one of the first experimenters in digital delivery of text content in this project called Star Text. And the Fort Worth Star Telegram was owned by a company called Capital Cities ABC. It wasn't 1984, but it was in the 80s, I think. Probably maybe more like 87 or 88. And so Cap Cities also owned the Kansas City Star and Times, where I worked at the time. And so we were getting ready to do our own Star Text project after Fort Worth did theirs. And at that point, I've done a lot of digital stuff, but I'm not. It doesn't come easy to me. I'm not a geek. When I get a new tool, I'm daunted by it. If somebody can train me, it's helpful. Usually when I have to figure them out, I find out they're much easier than I feared they would be, and that kind of thing. And so at this point, a guy named Dan Gilmore, who I'm sure you know, your students may not have heard of him, but he was a digital pioneer, is a digital pioneer, teaches at the Cronkite School now. And Dan was one of my reporters then, and I can't remember if it was Prodigy or CompuServe, but he had one of those early dial-up services, and I was thinking, okay, I need to figure that out. But to do that, you had to install a modem on your computer. And I can barely figure out which end of the screwdriver to hold, and so and they weren't like clip-in things at that point. You literally had to attach it into the guts of your computer to attach a modem, and so it was something I hadn't gotten around to yet, but I knew I needed to. And I said, I bet I'm not the only one like that. You know, the cable TV industry transformed the way we watch television, and they did it in part by coming to your house and getting it all done for you. They got it set up and put a control in your hand. The controls were much simpler then than they are now, but even then they showed you how to do it, and so I didn't have to figure out anything to get cable TV. And I said, we should do this. If we don't do this, we're just limiting ourselves to the geeks like Dan Gilmore who are going to figure this out and want to be the first with things like this. And they kind of nodded their heads, and we didn't do it. And StarTex never took off with the Kansas City Star and Times. And I'm not sure that would have revolutionized it and made it a complete success when it wasn't. But it was an illustration to me of something that many years later, when I worked on the Newspaper Next project with Clayton Christensen, who's the Harvard business professor, who's the world's leading authority on disruptive innovation, which is a phrase he coined. And he said that any business sees new opportunities through the lens of its established business, and if there had been a digital equivalent of just delivering the paper, that was all we needed to be successful there, that was fine. But to do something like the cable TV industry, well, we're not cable TV, we're in newspapers, we don't want to get into that business. Well, bullshit. We were in the transportation business, and owned or contracted with whole fleets of trucks to deliver our product. We were in the manufacturing business. We were never just in the news business, and and that's just one of many illustrations. When the several years later, the web came along, and people like me were getting online without having to screw in a modem. We were able to buy web-ready, internet-ready computers and those sorts of things. There were tremendous opportunities for organizations with the huge sales staffs that newspapers had to do what Amazon and eBay did, and to do what Google did, and we didn't do any of that because we were thinking about putting our newspapers online. And did we dare put our newspapers online? Can we put it online before we print it, before it hits your doorstep in the morning? And will we scoop ourselves? And so we were always limited by our by the format that we were successful with and the outlook that it gave us. And so if I were in charge of the newspaper industry 30 years ago with the knowledge that I have now, it would be that we've got to attack the future based on its opportunities, not based on the limitations of the past.
Yeah, I wish I had a nickel for every time I looked at a breaking news alert that comes to me now from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and think to myself, I wonder what conversation we would have had 10 years ago or 8 years ago about whether we should break that story online or not.
Yeah.
Because God knows we were still having them as recently as 8 years ago.
Yeah, yeah.
It's very disappointing. So I'm going to skip ahead. And I'm not going to talk about, as much as I'd like to, I'm not going to talk about your first 3 days on the job in Cedar Rapids.
That was interesting.
That's a great story, but it's not where I want to go right now.
Okay.
But what I want to talk about is you went there to be the editor of a newspaper.
Yes.
And you left there with a completely different title. And I want you to talk a little bit about that transition and why you made that transition and why that happened and whether you think it worked.
Sure. Well, that was an interesting story, and the flood is actually part of it, so it may come in. Um, I mentioned the Newspaper Next project that I was worked with Clayton Christensen and his company on it, and I don't want to overstate that. I didn't work closely with Christensen. I met him a few times, but my nonprofit worked with his consulting firm, and I learned a lot from him and his teachings, and I could see that the newspaper industry, when we would present the principles of Newspaper Next, everybody would say, "Yeah, that's exactly what this industry needs," and then they'd like pick one thing out of the this. We're calling for a wholesale transformation of your organization that will include these many things, and they'd grab one of those things and say, "Yeah, that's it. We'll create a niche product." And so I was very frustrated at the industry's initial response to Newspaper Next, and so I wrote. We were recognizing that we needed to push Newspaper Next beyond our first report, which came out in September of 2006, and so in 2007. I wrote the first draft of a new vision for community media that I called the Complete Community Connection, and that's on my blog too. If you Google that, you can find it. And I don't know if either Newspaper Next, if everybody had embraced it, or C3 as we called the complete. Newspaper Next was N2, Complete Connection was C3, and I don't know if either of those was the right name, but I don't know if either one of those would have saved the newspaper industry. But I sure would have liked to have seen one of them fully tried. And so I was arguing for C3 to be the second wave of N2, of Newspaper Next. And Steve Gray, who was running the N2 project, and Drew Davis, who was the CEO of the American Press Institute, which produced Newspaper Next, and who are good friends. I'm not bitter about this at all. They didn't want to go as far as I was proposing in C3 for the second wave of Newspaper Next. And kind of on two levels, on wanting to give my vision a try, and on not, and I could see what was happening for API, and API ended up completely collapsing, and it kind of came back in another form. But
the American Press Institute.
Yeah, yes, and so I knew I wasn't the right person. My job in the first wave of Newspaper Next had been selling our training and consulting and experiences, or services for Newspaper Next, and I knew I wasn't the right guy to sell the second version of it. And it, I'm not saying I was particularly insightful in that, but it did fall flat and didn't get any response. But I knew I wasn't the person to sell it. So I started looking to see if there was somebody that wanted to, in an editor or publisher or consulting role, give my C3 vision a try. And Dave Story, the publisher of the Gazette, and Chuck Peters, the CEO of the Gazette company, both really liked it and said, "Hey, this is great. We want you to come here as our editor, and we'll try and do this." And they were an independent, family-owned operation. Joe Ladke, the patriarch of the family that owned it, was in on the interviewing process, and he'd kind of turned the reins over to Chuck, but I could see that he had that he supported the level of innovation that Chuck wanted, and so we agreed to do this, that I would come to Cedar Rapids and lead the newsroom, but also lead the company's efforts in transformation. And I would love to know what would have happened if that flood hadn't hit Cedar Rapids on my third day on the job. But that flood took out 1,000 Cedar Rapids businesses. and 5,000 Cedar Rapids homes, and had a tremendous impact, financial impact, on this seemingly bold company I had just joined. And so again, I have no bitterness. We were in survival mentality, and by the way, that was just a hell of a news experience. And so as a journalist, you hate to see anything like that happen to the community. As a journalist, it was the story of a lifetime, and I have no, I remember it fondly. I've got, I don't know if you can see behind me there, the Epic Surge front page where we did a double truck front page with the flood hangs proudly in my office. So it was not. It was not, it was a great news experience. It was a great opportunity for some digital storytelling, and my staff, and I'll, take some credit for that, but you also have to say, whatever they do on your third day on the job, you can't take full credit for it, because I inherited a pretty good staff. But the continuing coverage, I had more impact, and I had some impact that day, too. And so I think we did some great things. But the company, and if you remember, the other thing that happened in 2008 was that in September, the economy tanked to the point that it killed John McCain's chances of becoming president, and Cedar Rapids and Iowa, felt that like everybody else. So we had this dual hit of a hell of a blow to our community, and rightly or wrongly, sometimes a disaster can be an economic boon to a community because of all the disaster relief that comes in. But FEMA had gotten so screwed up, some of which we saw in the aftermath of Katrina, but there was, some of the response to that wasn't working well yet either. And so disaster relief didn't start flowing quickly too. So we had the economic blow. We had a lot of costs for our. We were without power for a month in our newsroom. In our whole downtown plant there, where we weren't flooded, so we could get in, but we had no power, and so we had to spend $65,000 just to rent a generator to run both a TV station and a newspaper for a month, and 1,000 gallons of diesel fuel a day. So the economic blow to the company certainly changed the ability and/or the willingness to be as bold as the people I had interviewed with sounded. Mm-hmm. But we didn't back away entirely, and there were some respects in which Chuck Peters and I would say our visions overlapped, but they're far enough away from what most newspapers were doing that we both saw an alliance and a kinship there. But where they didn't overlap, he's the CEO and we got to do things his way. Which again, I understand that. There's no problem with that. But Chuck was very much more focused on changing the organization, getting the organization right for this future that he saw. And I was more interested in changing action, in changing what we do, and we'll drag the organization along with us. I agreed completely that we needed to change the organization, but I didn't think, because I've been through too many newsroom reorganizations that didn't change a damn thing, I didn't think that changing the org chart would fundamentally change an organization, but changing how you work and what you do, I think, can. And I saw that. We started live blogging, we started using social media more, we started using multimedia more, we changed a lot of things in the newsroom without changing structure first. And we did change, we had a social media guide who was a new position, but we didn't change all the positions. We just said, okay, we're going to do more social media. And as we're doing more social media, we had the need for this person to lead that effort. So Chuck was pushing organizational change and wanted to separate our content production operations from our products from the people who put out the newspaper. And he put on his blog once that he was blogging about what we were trying to do, and he put on his blog something about that the edit, that maybe you change the fundamental leadership positions. Maybe the publisher comes. I can't remember what he called the publisher, and maybe the editor becomes a community manager or something. I think it was community manager, and I thought, well, I don't want to manage the community. The community doesn't want me to manage it. I need to come up with a different term. I'm not going to dig in my, I'm trying to lead change. I can't be the guy who's digging in my heels saying, God damn it, I'm going to be the editor. And so I came up with a title that got mocked, and probably deservedly so, of community content conductor. So again, we're doing the alliteration thing. No, it was information content conductor. Excuse me. He was saying community information manager. That was what he was saying. And I said, okay, how about information content conductor? And I was thinking conductor has 3 different meanings that all seem to kind of apply here. There's the musical conductor who's leading creative people in doing something that's simultaneously improvised and coordinated, and those sorts of things. And there's the train conductor that helps customers get where they want to go and have a good customer experience. And then there's the electronic conductor that carries power and charges up things. And I thought all 3 of those definitions really can be metaphors for what we're trying to do here. So I came up with conductor instead of community manager, and I gave up the title of editor. A guy named Lyle Muller, who's an excellent journalist and a friend and colleague. I was glad to give him the opportunity to be editor of the Cedar Rapids Gazette, and kind of felt bad for him that as editor of the Cedar Rapids Gazette, he had no reporters working for him because they all worked for me because I was on the content side. What he had was designers and a copy desk and so on. And so that was the initial plan, and we were coming up with new jobs for all of the these reporters, and Chuck was driving some of that more than I was, but I liked where it was going, and and this shows it almost echoes of the response back in the 1980s to, hey, we should do something like TV or something. And we actually owned a TV station at the Gazette, and initially, because we had been grandfathered in back when the FCC wouldn't allow newspapers to own TV stations, they were very timid about doing anything together. But I had said initially, when Chuck was talking about separating content from product, I said we need to have the TV be part of this. That the TV reporters are part of the content creation team, and that there's a TV production team that produces newscasts from this content that the full team gathers. And initially they'd said no. That was something that Joe Ladke, the patriarch, was very nervous about, because he had been involved when they navigated some pretty touchy waters over having both TV and newspaper in the same town. And
how much of that separation between the production of the newspaper and the content of the newspaper, how much of that structure remains now?
Almost none of it. I'm not. They have reorganized multiple times, and that reflects, Chuck's interest in getting the organization right, and my notation, my view that you need to change what you're doing, not the organization. There are pieces of it that probably still exist, but I'm not. I've moved on enough that I can't say with a lot of expertise. But what happened was that Joe Ladke, the patriarch of the family, was the chairman of the board, but there was a board of family members from different generations, and I think 1 or 2 external members or whatever. and um, the, we were moving too fast for them. And in a meeting in March of 2009, they basically pulled the chains, pulled the reins on Chuck, and Chuck went to Plan C or whatever, which included they did this time put the TV in with it, but they slowed it down. They were gonna, work on. I mean, we were literally, this was March. We were gonna launch the sports version of this new project, the sports section of it, separating content from product. We were going to have that ready to go in early April, and or mid-April. And so this board meeting is in March, and like on April 9th or something like that, literally the week before we're going to hit the go button with sports. They put the TV news director in charge of the content team, and I was going to be this, kind of company-wide consultant and innovation coach, and so I was basically ousted. I was a kind of a full-time blogger for until I found another job, and I have no regrets about doing it. I don't have any bitterness. Chuck and I had lunch, a year or so after I left in Washington, and it's a messy thing trying to change an organization or trying to start an organization. We're seeing some of that now in First Look Media with Matt Taibbi's long-awaited and kind of ballyhooed project, The Racket, blowing up, and Taibbi's back at Rolling Stone, and nobody knows if The Racket's ever going to launch.
I want to talk a little about the idea of starting an organization, and I want to ask you about TBD.
Sure.
But before I do that, I want to sort of pause my questions for a minute and see if the students who are here in the Hangout have some questions of theirs.
Fire away. Unmute yourself.
So I'll start with Jacob. Introduce yourself, please, and then ask your question.
Hi, I am Jacob Kurth. I have a background in television news, and I now do public relations for a nonprofit. My question, I have two, but I'll ask one, and if we have time for two, I'll go to number two. The first one, do you think news will become so hyper-local that people won't care or won't get news that happens on a larger scale, be it national or internationally?
No, I don't. I think there's a very vibrant startup community dealing with national news, both broad national news and niche national news. That I think you look at the number of players in just in terms of covering technology news, that you've got TechCrunch, and you've got GeekWire, and you've got Mashable, and a lot of the traditional media too, the New York Times and Wired and Slate and so on. That I think there's a lot of players in it. The traditional newsrooms that cover national politics have certainly been disrupted and have made some cuts and everything, but you also have Politico and National Journal and Atlantic Wire, both which are all kind of neutral, although I think Politico's getting kind of conservative, but sort of traditional, impartial. Their model and their claim is to be impartial news organizations. At the same time that you have outfits like Talking Points Memo is a very liberal organization, and unapologetically so. But damn, they do a good job of reporting, of breaking stories and those sorts of things, and launched into national prominence by their reporting that helped bring down the Attorney General, Alberto Gonzales. So,
reporting, by the way, that started with asking readers for input.
Crowdsourcing. It was one of the great early examples of crowdsourcing, and so I think I don't think we're going to hurt on the national level. We might hurt more on the state level. I think state house coverage in most state capitals has diminished considerably, probably more than national reporting. And then maybe some of the regional national reporting, regionally focused national reporting. I used to work for the Des Moines Register for 10 years, and we had one of the best Washington bureaus in the business that did an excellent job, especially covering agriculture, but other topics as well. And the Des Moines Register doesn't have its own Washington bureau anymore. There are a lot of newspapers that used to have Washington bureaus. They're in St. Louis. They used to have like 7 or 8 people in the Washington bureau. Do they have anyone now? Probably just one, if that.
I think it's just one now.
Yeah. And so I think there are niches that are really getting hurt, but at the same time there are startups that are covering niches that were never covered. I'm not going to go into Patch because I'm sure Kurt's told you some about that, but in New Jersey, which was one of Patch's prime areas, I just read an interesting piece and actually have had an email exchange with the CEO of it, that there's a outfit called Tap Into. TAP stands for the Alternative Press, that a lawyer started up, and it's kind of a small version of Patch, of neighborhood people covering the news in an area that, if it has a newspaper at all, it's just a weekly newspaper. And and they're making some money, and it's a completely different scale from what Patch was trying to do nationally. But I'm friends with a guy named Scott Broadbeck, who's doing the same thing in Washington. He started with a website covering Arlington, Virginia, which is not that small a community, but it doesn't have a daily newspaper. And he started ARL Now and covered that well, and then he's expanded, and he's a growing business entrepreneur. He's got Bethesda Now and Reston Now, covering other suburbs, and he just launched Hill Now, covering Capitol Hill, not the building, the neighborhood, Capitol Hill. Mm. And so I think there are going to be there are going to be losses and there are going to be gains in the in the evolution of media. But I don't think that important areas are going to go uncovered for long. I think the market identifies those needs and will find ways to meet them. I think we'll have lots of entrepreneurs covering lots of different areas. I'm an optimist too. I'll confess to that.
No, that was very insightful. Thank you so much.
Glad to.
You're up, Jillian. Ishtiaq, you're on deck.
I'm not sure if it's frozen.
No, you're.
I can hear you.
Yep, we got you.
Okay. And I apologize if I'm asking. I have 2 questions. So if talked about, my computer must be running a little slow because it keeps cutting out.
I'm hearing you okay.
Okay, good. I was reading the intro that we received about you, and I noticed that you were one of the founding editors for TBD.com.
Yeah.
And I was trying to skim through the site, and it's probably since been kind of left. And I was curious, what exactly was that, and what would you have different now?
Good questions. TBD was a local site covering Washington local news. I guess that's redundant, but editors edit ourselves as we talk. It was launched by All Britain Communications, which also launched Politico. And it was sort of an attempt to do with local news what Politico had done with politics. That would be kind of the elevator pitch. Jim Brady, a good friend of mine who's hired me twice, and we weren't good friends at the time. We'd never met each other. I actually applied for this job with a direct message on Twitter, by the way. But I knew who Jim was. He knew who I was. We followed each other on Twitter, and we had exchanged some direct messages before. But I heard that he was going to do this, and I thought, okay, this was when I was the full-time blogger and on my way out in Cedar Rapids. And So I thought, okay, this is what I'd applied for a lot of jobs, but most of them were, okay, I'll take a shot. Let me see how this is. But when I heard Brady was going to be doing this Washington local news project, I thought, okay, I got to be part of that. I DM'd Jim directly and ended up getting the job. And what it was, and I think if they had stayed with the original strategy, it would have succeeded. In Politico, well, let me go back to Clayton Christensen. Clayton Christensen understands business and business innovation and disruption better than anybody that I'm aware of. And Christensen says you need to be impatient for profits, but patient for growth. And what he means by that is you want to start small enough that you can make money right away or pretty soon. And then, be patient and grow it as the money grows. Well, that's not the approach Robert Albritton took with Politico. Robert Albritton's got this, multi-billion-dollar communication empire his dad had built, and so he launched Politico with a lot of high-priced journalism talent. And they were planning the same thing. There was talk of hiring 50 people. I'm not sure we ever got to 50, although we were certainly in the 40s, for the launch of TBD. And so I was thinking, with my Christensen background, I was thinking, okay, is he pouring so much money into this that it can't succeed? And so I asked Robert when I interviewed with him, after I'd interviewed with Jim, and I knew Jim was interested in having me as one of the key leaders there. I said to Robert, how long of a runway do we have here? At what point do we need to be making money? Because you're putting a lot of money into this thing, and it's not going to cover those costs right away. And he said, well, this was in 2009. Politico had launched in January of 2007. They launched with the State of the Union message in 2007. And so in December of 2009, we're at the end of the third year of Politico. And he said, we're going to make money in our third year here. And I was willing to give it 5 years. And I thought, geez, this guy's got deep pockets. He could afford to lose money on a project for 4 years. But I knew that we could make money with that kind of a runway, and so that's what I decided to do. And there's different dynamics here, but it's important, just like it was with Chuck Peters and the Ladke family and those sorts of things. The dynamic there. Robert Albritton took charge of his father's media empire at about age 25. And he wasn't anymore ready to run a company that size than I was when I was 25. So I don't say that critically of him. It's just you need to learn a lot before you can run a company that big. And so his dad hired a guy named Fred Ryan to help Robert run the company, to be his CEO. Jim. And this part might be off the record. Jim likened Robert Albritton and Fred Ryan to George Bush and Dick Cheney. That Fred was the power behind the scene. And Fred and the Dick Cheney comparison is somewhat appropriate because of Fred's political background. Fred was a former Reagan White House aide who had run the Ronald Reagan Foundation, and by 2007, when they launched Politico, Fred was long past his political relevance, and suddenly Politico made Fred politically relevant again. Politico hosts, the State of the Union after party and things like, not the State of the Union, the White House Correspondents' Dinner after party and things like, that powerful people come. Into the Politico newsroom to be on TV and those sorts of things, and and so Fred was willing to give Politico all the time it needed because it made him politically relevant again. And in the extent to which it did Fred's now publisher of the Washington Post. He's the first publisher outside the Graham family of the Washington Post since like the 30s. So, but he didn't have the same passion for local news that he had for politics. And Jim had sold the idea to Robert Albritton when he was doing some consulting for Politico, and I don't think he understood the importance of either getting Fred on board, or Bill Lord was the TV station general manager for their two TV stations in Washington. WJLA is the ABC affiliate, and News Channel 8 was a all news local cable channel that they had, and we were going to be their digital presence. So it was a digital startup, but a digital startup associated with legacy media. And so the websites of News Channel 8 and WJLA, which were much more promotional than actual news websites, were going to go away. And we'd have some promotional stuff there, but the purpose of the website wouldn't be promotion. It would be, this is a news site covering Washington. And, and there were a whole lot of people in the building that were trying to block our success. So literally 3 weeks before launch, Jim had hired an excellent, I think, never got to see her, with a product to work for, but I really liked where she was going in the launch planning. He'd hired an excellent sales manager, Whitney Patton, and Whitney hired a couple of really good digital sales experts to handle our sales and to sell to the right digital audience. In collaboration with the TV sales folks. The TV sales folks could get us into doors of major advertisers that wouldn't give an independent digital startup the time of day, but they would also target digital people that the TV sales people would never call on. And so we thought it would be the best of both worlds, but the sales VP was pretty insistent that anybody involved in sales needed to report to him. And Whitney was reporting directly to Jim. And 3 weeks before we launched, they moved her not only under him, but under one of the TV sales managers who reported to the VP. And so Whitney walked, rightly so, and both of the sales reps she hired left pretty soon after. So we literally launched without our own sales team. We were like a throw-in for the TV salespeople, when they're trying to sell a TV ad. They say, "Oh, we'll get you a spot on the website too." And so we were never sold with our own value. And it sounded like such a good idea that we'd have this independent, edgy product built for the web and of the web, but that we'd have some of the advantages of legacy media in terms of the brand recognition and getting the redirect traffic from these two promotional websites as part of our base. But it didn't work out that way, and so we exceeded our traffic goals. We stirred up the Washington news scene, local news scene, and we're very excited. Literally 3 weeks after we launched, 3 weeks after we launched, there was a big national story that happened in Washington. A gunman took a hostage in the Discovery Channel building, and with almost no Google history, literally we'd been there 3 weeks. We were the #1 Google search result if you search Discovery hostage or Discovery Channel hostage. That we just absolutely rocked in coverage of breaking news and in social media. And we built a blog network. So I think we were showing the ability to build an audience that a sales team like the sales team that we had recruited would work with. But Jim left less than 3 months after launch. We launched in August of 2010, and Jim was gone by November. By February, they were laying off staff and changing the strategy, and they didn't. The only reason they didn't fire me was I had a contract. And I asked if they wanted to buy me out, and they said no. But if you find something else, we'll let you go. So I found a job again with Jim at Digital First Media, and took the and they let me out of the contract. But so it was a great experience. We put together a fabulous team and people who I think will be friends for life. I like what we accomplished. I'm glad I didn't know going in that it was going to flame out so soon, because then I wouldn't have done it. But I'm glad I did it. So I'm glad I didn't know that. It was, certainly a very strong confirmation that it is difficult to innovate within a legacy media company.
I was just going to say, I mean, it seems like the story of our lives.
Yeah.
We can't get out of our own way, number one, and number two, we're so worried about protecting what we already have that we can't innovate.
Yeah.
It just, that story, that theme just keeps coming up over and over again.
Sure.
I want to do a quick time check here. It's about 13 minutes before the hour, so I want to make sure we respect everybody's time here. Ishtiaq, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'll ask a very quick question for the sake of time. What do you think about this new phenomenon with blogs sometimes breaking news first? How do you see it affecting major news companies like the Times, whatever else in the long run?
Oh, I think that's been going on for quite a while. I mean, I mentioned Talking Points memo breaking and advancing and running with the story of Alberto Gonzalez, and that was, Bush. That was 2005. It was his first year of his second term, and so that's almost a decade that it's been going on. I think, and in TBD we broke multiple stories in Washington with a much smaller staff than the Washington Post, even though we were a bigger staff than a startup probably should be. But I think that, I'll give you a good example. A friend of mine, Crystal Knapp, spelled K-N-A-P-P, is a journalism entrepreneur in Princeton, New Jersey, who runs a site called Planet Princeton. And when remember the cameraman who got infected with Ebola was an NBC cameraman, and he was on the crew with Dr. Nancy Snyderman, NBC's chief medical correspondent. And she lives in Princeton, New Jersey. And so NBC said Snyderman wasn't showing any symptoms, and she was, there was no legal reason to quarantine her at that point. But NBC made a show of saying, we're going to voluntarily quarantine all of the other people that were with this cameraman over in, I think it was Liberia that they were, but somewhere in Western Africa where the Ebola outbreak is at the worst. And so Crystal, running this Planet Princeton site covering the community of Princeton, New Jersey, starts hearing from her sources, her readers, the people who engage, they're sending her tips that I saw Dr. Snyderman at this takeout place, stopping to get some dinner on the way home from something or whatever. And I think she had 2 or 3 sightings of Snyderman around town, and so she breaks the story that voluntary quarantine is bullshit. And others picked it up, and it became a national story. And New Jersey said, we got to quarantine her, which of course affected that other nurse in Maine, whose name I'm forgetting, from Maine, but who was in New Jersey at the time. And I don't know if Nancy Snyderman should have been quarantined or not, but NBC shouldn't say she's voluntarily quarantining if she's going to be out in the community. And that's the kind of thing that a local site like Planet Princeton, or like Patch if it had something in Princeton at the time, or an old style weekly newspaper is going to break because of how close it is to its readers. I did a blog post praising Crystal for this, and she said, "Hey, it's the readers. They're my news sources, and that's why I broke this story." So I think good journalists break stories, and there's a whole lot of good journalists doing blogs now.
All right, I want to ask a question from one of our other students. I'm going to adapt this question a little bit. Christopher Score wanted to know about Project Thunderdome, which is, in a very briefly, it's an effort that you were part of, along with Jim Brady, who you mentioned earlier, to consolidate production of content for the entire digital-first newspaper chain, but consolidate production of content that was perhaps of a national interest,
sure,
or would be useful for all of those outlets,
sure,
in a way to get some efficiencies about how content could be produced.
sure.
And I know that you've written that you didn't consider it to be a failure because it didn't really get a chance to succeed.
Sure.
Objectively, it did fail because obviously it's not there anymore.
Yeah.
But I wondered if you could talk about what the goal there was. And again, is this a case of what we talked about before? We can't get out of our own way, and we're too timid to really innovate.
Yeah.
And what was innovative about that too?
Okay. Well, what was innovative about certainly centralizing production of some national content is not necessarily a new thing. Gannett has a Gannett news service that serves all of its newspapers, mostly with Washington coverage, but some other national coverage. So in that sense, it wasn't necessarily new, but what it was starting from scratch and starting with a digital perspective. And so it was saying, okay, what should a national operation serving, I think it was 75 newsrooms in 15 states or something like that, what should it do? That rather than having 75 newsrooms, editing a story on, the Super Bowl or the Olympics or the, whatever the national story is today, the Ebola story, or election coverage, and Hurricane Sandy was one of the first stories they covered, and so on. That rather than having lots of people editing wire stories, we would produce all of the national content, whether we created our own content, provided our own coverage, or with partners, but there would just be one version that's going on all of these sites. But there was also an effort, so that's just an efficiency play, and there's nothing new about that. What was new was that it was digitally focused. We're not producing it for the newspapers. We're producing it for the websites, and if they want to put it in the newspapers, hey, that's fine too. But the other thing was we were creating a lot of really interactive digital content. We had an excellent data team that did some top-notch investigative and accountability and even breaking news journalism that served us all. For instance, the minutes after the Boston Marathon bombing happens, somebody on the data team knew or found out very quickly that the website for the marathon, I think that's who it was, had all the runners and their hometowns there and when they had finished. So we were able to provide each of our newsrooms with the names of their local runners, some of which they maybe already had, but we were able to tell them which ones had finished 2 minutes before the bomb. And so we had a team that was kind of that adept and digitally focused and sorts of things. That that's all an efficiency play, a better journalism play, But a piece of this was also that we were going to build national verticals that our national ad staff could sell. That if we've got the audience of the Denver Post and the San Jose Mercury News and the St. Paul Pioneer Press and 72 smaller newspapers and their websites, what could we do with a technology vertical, both with some partners providing content and the San Jose Mercury News, which it's not the paper it used to be, but there's still probably no newspaper that covers technology better than the one that's based right in Silicon Valley, or few newspapers at least. And and so we were developing topical verticals that we could sell to national advertising audiences, and because the plan was efficiency first, let's build the operation and then we'll start selling it. There was no pressure, and there was no cost to it. The positions all came from the newsrooms, so there was no additional cost. It wasn't a big expensive thing that was added on like TBD. But here was where the only reason it was shut down was that we were owned by hedge funds. Digital First Media was created from two formerly bankrupt newspaper companies, and so the owners were hedge funds. And hedge funds don't buy distressed properties to run them; they buy them to flip them. And they had decided that they wanted to start selling their properties. The original hope had been, by John Payton, the CEO, had been to find a buyer for the whole thing and take it out of the hedge funds as one unit, one operation. And so if you're thinking long term, you want that efficient, centralized operation. You want that revenue stream those new content sources would bring in. But the hedge funds decided to sell it in pieces. They thought I don't know if John was never able to find a buyer. I haven't been able to discuss this with John since I left. But I don't know if he wasn't able to find a buyer or if the buyers weren't willing to pay what the hedge funds wanted. But they decided to sell it in pieces. And if you're selling it in pieces, this fabulous forward-looking operation you built to serve the whole company is just overhead, and so that's why I say it didn't fail. It was not judged to have not met its goals, and thus we have to shut it down. The company changed its goals, and this no longer fit with them, and so they shut it down. And if you're in business as long as I have, and by the way, most of my jobs have ended happily. But if you're in business as long as I am, shit happens. And so I have no hard feelings about any of that. I probably would have made the decision in their shoes. Once they decided they were going to sell it in pieces, it didn't make sense to keep it. And maybe they could have sold it separately. But I don't know.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to invite you to this and why I'm so grateful that you took the time to do this for us was because I have had the privilege of watching you and reading about what you've written, trying to innovate, oftentimes in an environment where we're dealing with legacy media. And
Sure.
I guess I wonder if you felt like Sisyphus at times.
It's a big rock and a big hill. but I've met so many extraordinary journalists that I regarded all as a very positive string of experiences, even though they end up how I wanted them to.
Well, I want to just. We're right at the top of the hour now, and as I said, I promised this would be over by 5 o'clock, and I want to abide by that. So I'm just going to thank you again, Steve. We really appreciate it. I know the students appreciate it too. And I just thank you very much.
Well, I've enjoyed the conversation. The students have an excellent future there. I've enjoyed watching your career and the opportunity to learn from each other through digital technology.
Well, that's nice of you to say.
All right.
All right. You have a great afternoon.
Take care. You too.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.